Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another Herbivore Coffee Break webinar. Going to hold on for 1 second while the Zoom room fills up with attendees. I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. It should be a really fascinating discussion. In case you've forgotten, you're joining us for Data in the Multimodal City, Designing MDS 2.0. I think we've got a great crew of experts today, so the conversation is going to be led by Michael Schnuerle from the OMF. We also have David Rodriguez from Kiwibot, Regina Clewlow from Populus, and Alex Demisch from SFMTA. So without further ado, Michael, why don't you get us up to speed?
All right. Thanks a lot. I'll start sharing my screen here and kick it off. So, hi everyone, welcome to the Herbivore webinar. I'm Michael, I'm with the Open Mobility Foundation. I'm going to be the moderator for today's Herbivore event. The OMF's a nonprofit that governs the Mobility Data Specification, which we'll be talking about, and we convene stakeholders to improve that spec and release new versions of it. So a little bit about MDS to sort of set the context. You all probably know something about it, but MDS is used in over 160 different cities in 21 countries around the world. It's the plumbing layer between cities and companies to provide a two-way data exchange, which helps manage the public right-of-way. Based on this spec, a marketplace of tools exists for cities and companies built on the ecosystem that has sort of come out of MDS in general. For the modes work in MDS 2.0, which we'll talk about today, we've been working on it for over a year with dozens of public meetings and online forums, and we led a deep focus on it during our modes month last September. You can browse the latest draft and leave feedback on GitHub, and we'll probably have some follow-up for you for how to do that. You can see a link at the bottom there if you get to our GitHub page and look at our development branch. So, for 2.0 with modes, what we have done is we've actually reworked the architecture around MDS, the structure of it, to allow modes to work as sort of attachments onto an existing appliance. So you can think of MDS as like a KitchenAid appliance, and now we've allowed the ability to swap out the front end of them with different modes for your programs, for your companies, for whatever you want to use it for. And each of these different attachments can allow different recipes, different programs to be run in your cities. And this was done, the we here that reworked it is the public working group participants and our OMF steering committee members from both the public and private sector who are already using MDS for these modes. So what we're doing is we're adding these back into MDS officially because this data exchange is already happening in some way for each of them, and so we want to help standardize that with MDS. And this is not what we're going to talk about today, but I thought the audience might be interested. We also have a second data specification called the Curve Data Specification, and just so you can learn a little bit about it here, but go check our website. It's also a two-way data standard that helps pilot and scale dynamic commercial curb zones, so cities can express curb areas and measure events that happen in activity there and learn about what happened from the metrics. And we've already got about 30 public and private organizations using CDS since it first launched in April. So with that, let me introduce our panel and then jump into the discussion. So we have a city rep, Alex, who's at SFMTA, where the city's been managing taxis for a long time. We've got Populus, a mobility management platform represented by Regina, who's been doing car share and lots of other mode work as well for a while. And then we have an operator today with David, who's deploying sidewalk robots with Kiwibot pretty recently compared to the other modes. So with that, for each of you, I'd like if you could start, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Okay. Could you give a brief overview of how the MDS 2.0 modes work will impact each of your current work in cities? This question's for everyone, but we can start with Alex as the city representative.
Sure. So for those of you who are not familiar with SFMTA, San Francisco's Well, we have a lot of different roles. We're the public transit operator in the city. We're the City Department of Transportation. And like Michael mentioned, we're the taxi regulator. And we've had a long history of using data to regulate a lot of programs. So we've used MDS for micromobility, but we've also collected data, acquired data from our taxi operators for almost 10 years. It's 2013, it was written into our city's transportation code, which is the law. It's as close to writing things in stone as you can get, especially in our field. But the reason for that was to collect information to help regulate taxis. I mean, in the past, this information might have been written on paper waybills and submitted in these stacks of paper. So data has been a key cornerstone to like goals for like investigations, ensuring consumer protection, making sure the drivers aren't driving too long. There's also lots of information we just need to collect for programming, for kind of building with paratransit, trips to and from the airport. So there's just been a lot of information that's been needed to be collected. And we've been doing that for nearly 10 years with our own bespoke data spec. But we've been very interested in moving to an industry standard for a couple of reasons. One is because using open source data standards is a priority for our agency. Published data in GTFS, require GBFS for micromobility operators. We used MDS, and interested in the new emerging specs. There's GOFS, CDS, lots of alphabet soup there. But another reason to use industry spec is it can also leverage our existing internal infrastructure. We built out a big processing pipeline for micromobility. The use cases aren't the same for taxis as they are, but we can. There's definitely a lot of double dipping to be had. And I think most importantly, it's just having a standard, using a standard is just easier for everyone. It's easier to get the taxi companies to evolve, like we need to make changes to our spec as our policy needs have changed. And it's just a lot easier, as we've seen through the experience of MDS and micromobility, to kind of co-create that together. It meets the city's goals better at the end of the day and works better for everyone involved. So that's why we're interested in kind of bringing taxis into MDS and in making that another part of our what we do.
That's great, Alex. Thanks. Regina, do you want to talk about how the MDS 2.0 modes work will impact your work?
Sure. Yeah, happy to dive in. It's great to be here. And I can first kind of start with a bit of background on Populus and how we work with MDS and different modes. For those who aren't familiar with us, we're a curb and mobility management platform that helps cities bring in data from commercial fleet operators. We ingest enormous amounts of scooter data, thanks in large part to the introduction and evolution of MDS. And we work now with over 100 cities around the world to deliver this data. And over the past 4 years, new use cases have continued to crop up, year over year over year. And as Alex mentioned, there are a lot of other modes that existed that maybe cities were able to collect data from that weren't standardized necessarily. So the first new mode that we actually began integrating was actually car share back in late 2018, immediately after the introduction of MDS. Some of you who have been in the industry a while may remember that Lime introduced a car sharing service called Lime Pods. And so we were already ingesting their scooter data. And when Lime Pods were introduced, we started ingesting car sharing data and then helping the operators and cities reconcile how many parking events from those vehicles were occurring on the curbside. Over the past couple of years, we've seen other modes like sidewalk delivery robots, other car sharing operators emerge, and we continue to bring in data into our platform. But I would say that without the formalization of those modes within MDS, some of that work is a bit hacky and custom. And so it's nice for us to see the standard evolve and for us to help inform how the standard evolves so that we can meet different operators and different cities' use cases. And so that formalization just makes it a lot easier, I think, for all of the stakeholders to make sure that data can flow between cities and operators and from in the other direction in a way that makes it work for everyone.
Yeah, that makes sense from a platform perspective. Thanks, Regina. And David, do you want to introduce yourself and talk about the new work from the Kiwibot perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is David. I'm co-founder at Kiwibot. At Kiwibot, we build delivery robots. We are focused on the last mile. Our work with MDS started happening in 2019 when we took a decision as a company to ask for permission rather than forgiveness every time we come to a new city. We believe that changing the narrative and like avoiding that the robot industry becomes something similar to what the scooter industry was at some point is an incredibly important challenge. The usage of MDS has been super important for us in the sense that we can build long-term sustainable relationships with cities, and also that we can accelerate our vision of providing insights without PIIs, obviously, that cities can use to accelerate ADA compliance. So we think that this element, MDS, is important long-term, as it is the intersection where private entities and public entities can cooperate and accelerate greater good beyond just commercial outcomes. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's interesting. So, all of you expressed that some of this work and this data exchange is happening whether on a regulatory level or on a volunteer level from Kiwibot. What are the benefits of getting involved in the development of this to take those learnings and put it back into MDS? So each of you are very involved with OMF and the work that we do and trying to give your feedback to the new version of MDS. So what are the benefits of getting involved now while it's still being developed? And David, I could start with you again.
Yeah, so in general, I resonate with Regina's comment, actually, that MDS is something that is becoming the standard rule, has a lot of logics that are useful for us operators to understand how cities are planning, to understand what's the future of mobility. And when you participate actively into building the framework, you get two benefits. On one end, you understand the logic of how cities are reasoning on their own spaces, and this affects the pitch and the conversations we have with cities. On the other hand, it is very important to have this collaboration in the sense that we will also understand for other companies how other companies are going to be regulated. And this helps us, in a way, be a type of big brother on the industry, that we can support other companies entering a market without damaging the environment. We believe that the outcomes of each company on their environment affect the long term. If the environment becomes toxic and companies start acting without proper regulation, it's going to hit us back in 10 years. So we're very happy to shape the future of an industry where we know we're not the only player.
Yeah, thanks. And so Alex and Regina, both of you, your organizations are on the steering committee for the development of MDS. Do you want to speak, if you want to speak to anything about how that benefits you or why you think it's a good idea to participate?
I'm happy to kick off. So because we work with so many cities and so many operators, we see a lot of the edge cases that might emerge. And one of the key values that we think participating very actively in the steering committee for MDS, and we're also on the steering committee for CDS, is to help shape those standards so they address our stakeholders and our customers at cities' use cases. And so I'm sure, as you know, Jean, our head of product on our team, has been really active in helping shape the MDS policy APIs. One of the key challenges I would say that we've seen emerge that we're hoping to help solve by participating in creating these standards and then also communicating them back to cities is policies have actually morphed into a variety of different types that I would say are in many ways less standard than the data that's being shared from operators to cities. So the policies that are being shared from cities to operators sometimes morph into more boutique custom policies. And from an operator perspective, it probably makes it really hard for them to comply. And so one of the things we're seeking to do is to help make sure that we address all of the most common use cases for policies and help educate and inform not just operators, but also cities on how they can adopt the standard to make it easier for everyone to follow the rules of the road.
That makes sense, Alex.
I think having just the collaborative environment has been really helpful to David's point earlier. I mean, in the past, we've just kind of developed data specs, essentially in a vacuum. I mean, that's kind of been the MO for a lot of cities, just like kind of go it alone, maybe huddle with some of the companies or other cities, or like copy paste whatever another city has done. But that's got a lot of problems too, because you just propagate a lot of the issues. But having this collaborative environment, which is taking at least the city, official out of like a regulatory role, in which it's everything is written into stone and there's rules that need to be adhered to. Just being able to be more open and share. Okay, like this is the goal. This is what we're trying to achieve. We think this would be a good way to do it, but getting input from the software company side, from the operator side, from other cities is just, I think, it's huge in being able to develop a solution that's just a lot more flexible and a lot more sustainable in the long run. And even just hearing what other cities are dealing with and how they've been trying to use things like the MDS policy API in ways that we haven't is also just really helpful learnings as well.
Yeah, and Alex and Regina just touched on another feature of MDS 2.0, which is the changes to the policy API, which is how part of that two-way communication where cities communicate out what the rules are in a digital way instead of having to rely on a PDF or something like that. So I'd like to get Alex to start to talk about the ecosystem around some of the modes, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this. So with micromobility and delivery robots, maybe the ecosystem there for the stakeholders and how they interact with MDS, they've traditionally done more of their data feeds in-house, while like, for instance, taxis and car share, which have been around for a longer time, are sometimes using outside entities to help manage their MDS data feeds or that exchange of data, and maybe have an extra layer of software providers that they're working with. So maybe if you could each just talk about that ecosystem if you'd like. And Regina, maybe we could start with you as a platform that kind of sees it from all sides.
Yeah, sure. So I think, one of the benefits of MDS for newer operators is that when it emerged, it was at a time when the micromobility industry was relatively young. And so quite frankly, the cleanest, best data typically comes from micromobility operators, because they were introduced in cities at a time when cities began immediately asking for data, and when MDS emerged as a standard to standardize how they shared their data. Unsurprisingly, then, the data that comes out of any mode that existed and operated and had data pipelines before MDS existed or other standards existed, like parking systems, delivery services, car sharing operators, which existed long before micromobility. I think all of those services take just a bit more work to reshape legacy data pipelines and conform it into a new data standard. That doesn't mean the work can't be done. It can be done. It's very useful to do the work. Technology will continuously evolve in the transportation ecosystem over time. But new modes do have the benefit, if they aren't already operating, of entering a world where data sharing and standards exist.
Yeah. Similarly, the taxi world has a lot of history, and I certainly learned a lot of that working with my taxi colleagues and understanding their needs and what they're working with. And there's, the company that the color scheme of your taxi is going to be different than the data provider that collects and processes the data. It's going to be different than the dispatch company potentially, but it could all be the same. So there's just a lot of history and a lot of roles that are just, usually centralized in the micromobility operator space, but it's dispersed amongst a lot of different organizations. And I think just all the more reason for a standard, like as our needs are changing and we need to make a change to our in-house data spec. It's there's a regulatory authority to make the change, but there's also can be pushback from companies, and this is going to take a lot of time to develop, and just all the better if if everyone is developing towards the same thing, and should they operate in another city, that they can kind of plug and play there just as easy as this is with micromobility.
Alex, I'd like to follow up with you. So you bring up a point where, just because these data standards exist, like MDS and with the 4 modes that it's going to be able to support in 2.0, that doesn't mean like the cities all have, or agencies or states, whatever, have the regulatory authority to ask for that data. So they still need that authority. But I guess I'd like to ask you, from your perspective with taxis, you're already collecting a lot of data from them. But how does that differ from like what other cities are collecting? And then I know maybe this is like a connected question, but how does your work and work with MDS account for privacy in this realm? And I want to ask you specifically, because you're one of the first 2 cities to use the policy requirements feature, where you specifically say you want or don't want certain fields in your data feeds.
So one of the most interesting conversations in the MDS working group around the passenger services mode with our requirements is collecting a driver's license ID. This is something that SFMTA has collected, and for nearly 10 years, it's part of what's essentially required by law for us to collect, so that we can perform those investigations. But that is personally identified information. It's different. I think there's a different level of expectation for an operator of the service versus a passenger or a customer of the service. But it's one of the first forays into personal information that we've done, and we've had a lot of back and forth. But ultimately, from SFMTA side, it's we need to collect this. So in the spec, there's a driver ID that is currently an optional field. Some cities may not require that. I mean, just kind of comparing what other cities are collecting, the passenger services mode isn't just about taxis, it's about TNCs. So it's kind of a different area, even though it's the same, as very similar as far as the mode of transportation. But we, I think, agreed to treat that as an optional field. And then getting to the policy requirements feature, this other mechanism of MDS has been really helpful, because when we have optional fields in the spec, and maybe an operator is applying for a permit, or they have a permit and they say, well, it's optional. Like, well, what does that mean? Who gets to choose? The policy requirements feature allows the city to express the requirements in digital form. I mean, we still have the dozens of pages of appendices in the permit, but the intent is to be able to express that in a standardized way. And what it also allows us to do is to say, certain fields are required. So it says optional. We're saying that these are required, but also, just as importantly, it allows us to say what fields are disallowed. So for us in the taxi implementation, we would say that the driver ID is required. Other cities might say that it's disallowed, and we've used this feature in MDS for micromobility, where we collect data for our shared electric moped program, where we explicitly disallow any routing information, because that's not information that we really need for regulatory or analytical purposes. So there's all these different modules of MDS, and we can use them. They interact with each other, and they complement each other. And I think that's been a fantastic way of protecting privacy while still being very thoughtful and nuanced in what is being collected, ensuring that there's the use case and the authority to do so.
Regina or David, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I can kind of chime in a little bit on the privacy question. I think, one thing to keep in mind is that private companies everywhere have enormous amounts of data about us. I have a watch that's tracking probably too much information. But one of the benefits of working with a platform like Populus is that if you're working with a platform that takes privacy seriously, is that we can take in data that is sensitive at scale, but also at scale aggregate and anonymize what ends up being delivered to cities that might end up sitting on city servers. So I was a researcher, a data intensive researcher when I did my PhD at MIT and in subsequent years. And it is true that sometimes you don't really know what questions to ask until you see the data. And so I know a lot of operators don't like, cities researchers asking for more data than they know the explicit questions to ask of, but it's because it is hard to know which questions to ask until you see the universe of data. I think that more data is better in the mobility ecosystem in order to empower cities to be able to make the policy changes and decisions that they need to make. I think otherwise then we get caught flat-footed and end up behind on safety goals, behind on sustainability goals, behind on climate goals. Privacy is in protecting that data is incredibly important. We do need to keep it in the context of all the other data that is out there about us that exists in the world today. We take it very seriously and want to make sure that cities are able to get the insights they need while also maximizing, the usefulness of that data from operators.
And David, from your perspective, sidewalk delivery robots, they have sensors and other things. How does privacy impact what you do and then the information you share through MDS to the cities?
Yeah, I think that, and we've had this conversation before, we believe that we are as good as the trust we can build in our communities. And to us, we have a very strong position into how our data can never be PII oriented. We've taken extra steps even for streaming that we will obscure any information that can lead to PIIs. In our sense, for instance, we obscure faces, we obscure license plates. So essentially, we're all about what's going on the road. In this sense, and even within the OMF, there have been interesting conversations. Some other companies have even thought about processing images and say use machine learning or AI to take these images and produce data. Directly, what we're doing is different, trying to be more like forward-looking in the sense of information processing is literally to say take the horizontal displacement on a street and put it as a number and upload a number through MDS. So essentially, we're building pipelines that are very powerful, where information that is useful for cities, useful for ADA adoption, can be sent as values and never, ever making this something that could affect one person. We've had challenges, for instance, where we will find scenarios where homes are single-family houses. So essentially, if you can start tracing information that goes to one location, you essentially know like some habits of these stages. So we're taking steps so that we cluster up information and deliver information in a very safe way, so that this can never be taken on the wrong way. And rather, when people think about the robot delivery service, not only will they understand that it's providing supply and demand solutions, but also that the intrinsic nature of robots participating on the road creates an external benefit to the community. So everyone welcomes their presence. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I'll point out that the OMF has created a privacy guide for cities, and that was created with our public members and private members and run through some of our working group meetings. And it talks about a lot of the things that you all just mentioned, plus a lot more in a lot of detail. So we encourage everyone to look at that, and especially cities. Cities with this guide and with other guidance we give them, they can, I think, manage this MDS data pretty well. And like Regina said, kind of in sort of the flip side versus cities versus operators, cities also have a lot of information that is much more personally identifiable than the MDS data that's coming from the operators, in other areas like health departments and things like that, permits. So I think cities typically have some sort of framework for this, and the guide helps make that a little bit more clear. So I'm going to ask one more question for each of you to answer, and then we'll go to the questions that people are leaving in the Q&A. So You've talked about some of this already, but why not just keep doing things the way that you've been doing it? So, like in SFMTA, you're already getting taxi data and there's already car share data going back and forth, and Kiwibot's already working with San Jose and other cities to send data around operations. So why not keep doing that instead of standardizing onto MDS 2.0? And I guess that's a bit of an easy question, but if you have any nuanced thoughts there, I'd love to hear them. Maybe David, you could go first as an operator.
Yeah, I think that in general, something that is very important on a private perspective is both the speed to market and the size of the market and how much can we build on that market. If every city has a different mobility infrastructure and essentially we have to comply to different standards per city, the development cost of opening an additional city is going to be much greater. Additionally, as we understand a framework, it's replicable, of course. That speed also traduces into better service, better understanding of the market, which ultimately increases the lifetime value of each operation. With this also, we can inform ourselves in a standard way on which cities have more challenges, which cities has less challenges, and ultimately make operational decisions that are informed and which information is also going to be valuable for cities. Yeah.
Great, and maybe to Regina next.
Yeah, and one of the other kind of key things that we're seeing as a challenge in many cities is the intersection of MDS and CDS. So the curb data specification is really designed to help cities better manage that curb space, and transitioning all of their parking regulations into that format is a pretty heavy lift. So what's the benefit? Well, a big part of the benefit is the ability to more easily communicate how that space should be used, not just to individuals like you or I, but also commercial fleet operators that are growing in size and using that space, connected vehicles, the future of autonomous vehicles. And most of that information only exists in analog form and is very difficult to interpret. And so we think that there are huge benefits in transitioning that data into a digital format so that cities are as connected as the vehicles on the roads that are using them.
Alex, you want to wrap up this question? Why not keep doing things the same way?
I think David and Regina hit a lot of the key points there. I mean, even David, you said that speed to market. Like even on my side, I'm thinking just responsiveness. I mean, developing your own spec, it takes longer. There's more back and forth with the service operators and similarly their data providers. That just takes the technical piece out of setting up a policy and a program. It takes the technical back and forth, takes it largely out of it. I mean, we have a new scooter permit program. There's very few questions about like MDS. What's that? I think everyone knows what that is, and it's kind of just assumed that this is part of it. And that also means just quicker turnaround. When my bosses ask, well, how is the program doing? Like, how many users are they adhering to the regulations? It's just quicker turnaround time. And Regina started talking about the interplay between CDS and just standards generally. I mean, it's because having a standard allows us to do things faster, but in some cases, you even need a standard just to be able to do something. Releasing data in whatever format makes sense for us or the person who designed the data set. That can work well for maybe open data purposes for researchers, but if we're talking about service providers, companies ingesting data, they're not going to do a one-off integration with every single city that they operate in. You need to have that critical mass around a standard.
Yeah. Thanks for that. So, before we get to the question, I want to point out that with the work on 2.0, we're covering a lot of new modes. We've talked about each of them today to some degree, but the framework, the architecture of it allows us to add new modes in the future more easily. One mode, for instance, that we didn't address specifically was delivery in general. Like we were really focused on sidewalk delivery robots, but we did not get into delivery like freight or package or food delivery, things like that. We do get into that with the curb data specification. And so with the future MDS mode, maybe at version like 2.0, 2.1 after 2.0, we may be able to get into other modes like other types of delivery. There's been talk of urban air delivery because that requires a few tweaks to how MDS works, especially in 3 dimensions. And then even urban taxi passenger services that way. So, so the great thing about it, I think, is that we're taking these learnings of what's already happening as other things happen. We'll be able to incorporate those into the next versions of MDS a little easier. So let's go through some of the questions from the Q&A and keep asking them if you have them. So for Alex and Regina, what are the biggest challenges in sourcing data about TNC operations and from courier network services?
I can start. My answer's pretty short. For us in regulatory authority, we do not have the regulatory authority to collect data from TNCs. It's something that authority lies with the state, the California Public Utilities Commission. So we are constantly filing comments with them, requesting data, stating why we do need it. And another one of the reasons I've been excited about passenger services spec is also including TNCs and being able to point to a specified industry standard spec that allows for collecting that data.
Yeah, I'm happy to dive in. I think that, Alex definitely, touched on the biggest challenge, which is the regulatory authority and who has it. And it varies, across the US, across Europe, whether it lies with a city or a state or a regional authority. And so that's certainly one of the biggest challenges, is that it's a patchwork when it comes to who has regulatory authority. I do think that there are benefits, I would imagine, given that there are a lot of entities that do receive data in the US and in Europe from TNCs. And I presume that most of that data are boutique data requests. And so I think there are advantages to moving forward with standard to help standardize how all those different agencies currently receive data to make it easier for everyone, for them to get the data more quickly, for operators to be able to deliver it at a lower cost. And then when it comes to delivery services, there are a lot of cities that are moving forward to implement the curb data specification so that they can share commercial loading zones more effectively. Right now, most operators currently pay for access to curb space in the form of parking tickets, which can be very expensive in some cities. And so I think there are a lot of benefits towards moving the regime towards a compliant pay-as-you-go mode, as opposed to let's take the risk, park vehicles in perhaps even more unsafe situations and eat an enormous number of parking tickets each year. And so I am very optimistic that with CDS and a lot of the curb pilots that we see happening, delivery operators will actually maybe even move faster than TNCs.
Thanks for that question, Hayes. We've got another question. This maybe seems teed up for David, but what's the benefit for operators to comply with MDS? I think you've touched on it a little.
Yep. I think that on our case, first of all, I cannot stress enough that legitimacy is always a big word when you're trying to build long-term business. So the fact that you can really collaborate with cities, understand pains, has led us to understand the market a lot better. And this even has commercial outcomes. For instance, we run a 4-city pilot with the United Foundation, of course, in the middle of MDS and OMF. And we realized that not every city is a city where robot delivery can happen. And as much as it was really sad to understand that the total addressable market for robot delivery is not as huge as we thought, we also realized that there is a lot of opportunity into doing sidewalk mapping, in understanding compliance, that everything that is an issue for a robot is also an issue for someone in a wheelchair. and that we can really bring solutions to that. So that was one. Additionally, being able to have understanding on the environment, understanding on how different regulations go, has helped us scale faster. Right now, starting from scratch, right now we have 27 cities with permits across 18 states. Many times as a private company coming to the regulator and telling them, hey, this is what we've learned from regulations in other cities. This is MDS. This is a way by which we can learn together on what's the usage of space, has really helped us scale faster. If we can go not only to a college campus, but the surrounding city, now we can operate 7 days a week, and now we can operate 12 months a year. So all of this is possible thanks to support that we have from places like the OMF. I would say that's kind of the biggest advantage we have found out of this.
Great, thanks for the answers. I'm going to answer two questions on here pretty quickly. So one question is, how can I start consuming MDS data for research? Angela, one of our employees, she can put a link in the chat for a blog post we have about this. I mean, basically, the OMF itself doesn't collect any data, so you would need to go directly to the source of like the city source is probably the most likely one. Let's see, and another question is from CCTA, how many MPOs participate, and you'd like to participate? Yeah, that's great. We have a number of MPOs that do participate. SANDAG comes to mind, they're on their steering committees. So yeah, feel free to reach out to the OMF and we can help give you more information about how, as an MPO, any public agency is open to participate. Really, any public and private agency is. So this is a question, I think there's a lot of great answers to this question, I'm sure, but what are the use cases published? Maybe some details around how CDS or MDS has helped cities reduce traffic issues, support equity, and increase revenue. I mean, I'm sure you all have ideas on this. Maybe Alex, I know you've been doing a lot of work, definitely with equity, also with handicap accessibility, maybe traffic issues, and certainly something about revenue generation as well.
Yeah, I think thinking of, we have like kind of any formal evaluations. We did an evaluation of our scooter pilot after a year, but we do have some blog posts around the adaptive scooters, and we've used various MDS endpoints to support reporting on those. I can find some links and get them disseminated out.
Great. Any other thoughts from the panelists on this?
Yeah, I can share a couple of examples. I think, one example that comes to mind is Baltimore. City of Baltimore has had some really robust equity policies in place from the beginning of their program, and they've produced a number of reports using our platform and access to the data about how they've been able to improve access in neighborhoods that were historically underserved. They also saw some interesting trends during the pandemic where they found micromobility really served a stopgap when transit service needed to be reduced for people to access essential services, groceries, hospitals, et cetera. So a lot of the trip analysis they were able to do with the data was really helpful. I think when it comes to CDS and revenue generation, we're just the very early stages of realizing that. What I will say is my general point of view, and I think a lot of people's point of view, is that we currently really subsidize personal vehicle ownership and subsidize larger, more polluting vehicles. And we need to really shift the dynamics of how we price for access to public space. Unfortunately, MDS has been really beneficial from a city planning perspective, a policy perspective, advancing the digital mobility management ecosystem. I do think that we're at a point where we have to ask, what should we really be charging micromobility operators for access to space versus other larger vehicles? And that's where I think we need to continue to accelerate on CDS and managing those larger vehicles more effectively.
Great, and we do have a use case database which we can share out as well, which has use cases and how MDS can be used for these questions, but also for a lot of other ones. So Regina, you touch on another question, and I'm just going to keep keeping us on these questions until Jonah tells us our time is up. But so individually owned bicycles, e-bikes, and scooters are extensive users of the transportation system. How do you envision data being collected for these? This is sort of a future thinking question. One that honestly, the OMF hasn't really gotten into too much.
Well, I think that there have been a lot of advancements in collecting traveler data over the last decade. When I was at UC Berkeley's postdoc, Laura Schnuerle was starting Streetlight Data, and they have a lot of really amazing data to help people understand travel patterns and how many people are on which type of modes. Strava Metro is another, I think, really interesting example. Yeah. So when it comes to understanding what are travel patterns, I think there are a lot of existing data sets that cities have been leveraging for some time. And the real advantage of MDS is that it's much more interactive, and it's really about mobility management.
And just adding on, I mean, there's also, more infrastructure heavy approaches like, using bike counters in city streets. We're really interested in, how many traversals are there on a certain corridor or a certain street, or for before after study. But yeah, I agree. Leveraging other data sets to get that information, in the aggregate is just really what we're interested in.
Let's see, I'll pick this question, which just came up. What levers can cities pull to encourage the adoption of MDS and CDS? Why not require MDS spec in RFPs? It's a great question. Anyone want to talk about it?
I think a lot of cities already do for MDS specifically. So I think that's been going on for some time, from 2018 to today. When it comes to CDS as a requirement, I don't think it's been baked into permits as one key kind of mechanism to ask for data or share data, or require data from vendor platforms like Populus, for example. But I think it's an important strategy to help ensure the data standards really take off.
Yeah. On our perspective as an operator, we think that and I really like Alex's point on this. Like, if the city knows how to regulate, it's going to be easier to regulate, and that makes everyone happy. In this regard, there is kind of another level of thought that we have considered and even discussed with some cities. Is one where, say, it will cost you, I'll say whatever, $10,000 to have a number of robots on the right of way, and that's kind of the cost of the permit. We're envisioning scenarios where we can pay for our city permits with MDS data, probably in areas where we do not necessarily operate. Because if we're going to pay $10,000 and those $10,000 are not going to help collect valuable sidewalk ADA data, then it's better that we collect the data directly for you, and that we work for you in that sense, and we can operate so the P&L doesn't get hurt. So I think that MDS is a great meeting point for regulations, like moving forward. In the end, this collaboration is important because cities don't know how we operate, and we don't know what cities want. So as we meet in the middle with MDS, I think that we can provide more service for the community. We can save expenses on regulation, and altogether, again, I think this is a great spot to sprout larger conversation, more collaboration, and more business.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of encouraging use, propagation of MDS, because I was just thinking in my head, like, well, there's, in addition to what Regina said, which there are ways to ensure that the industry is also staying up with the later versions of MDS. The only other previous thought that I had is that city requirements lever. If cities don't require MDS or the latest version of CDS, a lot of the players aren't necessarily incentivized to make those upgrades. But that's a great idea, David.
All right, we've got 2 more questions. They're sort of a little bit more broad. We'll see if we can tackle them in some way. So one question is, how does mobility MDS interact with efforts to mitigate flooding in coastal towns and battling sea level rise? Any thoughts on that one?
We actually did work with a number of cities to help them communicate road closures, and that was one of the use cases. So when there was flooding in other places with inclement weather, I think that is one of the use cases for communicating with travelers to make sure folks can be rerouted.
I mean, I think in general, like having access to data around, especially micromobility and bike share, that helps encourage alternate modes of transport, which can reduce the carbon impacts of people getting around in a city, which can then help overall globally if everyone's doing that. Obviously, sea level issues, but that's big thinking right there. That takes a while to implement. David, do you have a thought?
Yes. So this is a conversation we've had with cities as well. Like how, say, we geofence an area within a downtown that not only robots, it can also have scooters and other modes of operation. One of the nice projects that segues into this conversation is putting CO2 like elements into the robots. So we can not only say what's the use, if a street is closed, then we're gonna detour, and that can be seen through the Populus platform. But essentially, this information can provide type of maps and data that are useful for cities' daily life. Imagine having a Google Maps with an accessibility option, or that you can go around a city finding the walk that minimizes CO2 emissions, or that you're going to breathe less CO2. So I think that the understanding on the basic level of MDS and how that data aggregates can help cities predict where are we having an issue as a closure, as all the vehicles are just returning. So you can deduct information. And I think that's kind of the beauty of large data sets that are happening at the same time. Yep.
Well, just kind of to build on that, Michael, and what you were talking about earlier around transportation, climate change, I think that, we all know transportation is the largest growing source of emissions. And one of the key opportunities for MDS, CDS, and cities having access to better digital tools is to be able to more quickly and more effectively implement policies. So, we know, for example, with CDS, a lot of cities' key use cases around curb management are centered around how do I incentivize and accelerate the transition towards lower carbon modes, including e-cargo bikes, including electric delivery vehicles. And I think similarly, we haven't really talked much about this within the MDS community, but technically it would actually be quite easy to create a congestion zone and price different types of vehicles coming into that congestion zone. The key challenge is really regulatory in nature, but the data standards do help enable that type of implementation of policy and getting there much more quickly.
Yeah. Great. Well, I'll quickly answer the last two questions and I'll kick it over to Jonah. So how could MDS standardization benefit from granular infrastructure data ingested from computer vision? It can benefit. I think it's something Kiwibot's doing. A lot of that data, like a subset of that data, can be turned into MDS information that's passed on to a city. So it sort of gets synthesized and you can send that along with your MDS feeds. And then, is there any plan to regulate MDS as a worldwide standard to enforce operators to use it? First, MDS is a worldwide standard. We have a lot of people using it that way. There's not really any way for us or anyone in the world to just make it a regulatory thing that happens in every city and every country. That's up to the jurisdictions. We do have MDS being used at country levels in Europe, and then at maybe at state levels in some provinces and states, and then obviously MPOs we've talked about a little bit, and cities as well. So it's up to those jurisdictions to make use of it. So I'll kick it back over to Jonah for a wrap up, and thank you all. Thanks to all our panelists for being such great panelists today.
Thank you, Michael. I'm looking forward to the UN decree that it has to be used worldwide. So, and any day now. But no, thank you, panelists. This was a fantastic conversation. I think really informative, really detailed. You guys are such experts, so thank you for your time. To our audience, thank you for joining us so much. I just want to add, if you enjoyed today's conversation, we're having a little industry happy hour next Tuesday in downtown LA. So everyone check your inboxes, please join us and meet some interesting folks working on mobility, open standards, curb stuff. And then of course, next March 3rd is Curbivore 2023. So if you really want to get to see the technology, meet the people, and try some of the technologies that are shaping the future, please join us. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks to Curbivore for hosting.